The rain in Bastogne didn't just fall, it froze before it hit the dirt, turning the shattered spruce trees into jagged glass. Private Thomas Miller sat on an overturned crate, his hands wrapped around a dented tin cup that held nothing but lukewarm water and grease. He was 19, but his eyes looked 50. Around him, the frozen hell of the Ardennes raged on. Men were coughing up blood, their boots wrapped in burlap rags because the supply trucks hadn't made it through the German encirclement in 6 days. Thomas adjusted the bandage wrapped tightly around his left shoulder. It was soaked through with dried, dark blood from a shrapnel tear 3 nights ago. The field medic had told him he was done, that he needed to get back to the clearing station before the gangrene set in. But there was no clearing station. There was only the perimeter. Then came the sound that made every man in the mud freeze. It wasn't the distant whistle of an 88mm shell, nor was it the rattle of a half-track. It was the sharp, commanding roar of a 3-ton command car tearing through the mud, defying the ice, its tires throw up black slush. The door slammed open like a pistol shot. Out stepped General George S. Patton, Jr. He stood like an iron spire against the gray sky, his polished leather boots gleaming despite the liquid mud surrounding him, his ivory-handled revolvers resting against his hips. His eyes scanned the miserable tree line, cutting through the fog like headlights. Patton didn't look at the frozen horizon. He looked directly at the men. He stepped over the carcass of a destroyed Jeep, his heavy coat flaring behind him, and stopped less than 10 feet from Thomas. The silence that fell over the clearing was absolute. Even the artillery miles away seemed to pause. Patton looked at Thomas's tattered uniform, the blood-soaked bandage, and the heavy leather satchel tucked securely under Thomas's right arm. Inside that satchel was a wooden box, bound with brass hinges and locked with a small padlock. Hand over the satchel, son, Patton's voice rasped, cold and sharp as a bayonet. Thomas's throat locked. He knew who stood before him. Every soldier in the Third Army knew the legend, the ruthless force of nature who moved divisions like chess pieces and demanded absolute, unyielding obedience. To disobey Patton was to invite court-martial, disgrace, or worse. But Thomas didn't move. He didn't offer a salute. Instead, he pulled the leather satchel closer to his chest, his knuckles turning white through his fingerless wool gloves. "I can't do that, sir," Thomas whispered. His voice trembled, but his grip on the strap did not yield. Patton's eyes narrowed into slits. A vein pulsed along his jawline. In the military, in the middle of a battle that would decide the fate of Europe, a refusal from a private to a 3-star general wasn't just insubordination. It was treason. Patton reached down, his gloved hand resting lightly on the cold butt of his revolver. He took a single, deliberate step forward, his shadow engulfing the sitting private. "You have 10 seconds to hand over that satchel, Private," Patton said, his voice dropping into a low, deadly register that vibrated through the crisp winter air. 10 seconds, or I will clear this insubordination myself. 10. Thomas felt the breath leave his lungs. He remembered his father, a blacksmith back in a small town in Pennsylvania, who had taught him that a man's word was the only thing the world couldn't take from him. Before Thomas had shipped off to Europe, his father had given him one single task, one quiet promise to fulfill, no matter what happened on the battlefield. 9. The surrounding soldiers held their breath. Nobody moved. Nobody dared to plead for the boy. Captain Mercer, standing a few paces behind Patton, reached for his holster, his face pale as chalk, paralyzed between the fear of his commander and the horror of what was unfolding. 8. Thomas's fingers dug deeper into the leather. Inside that brass-bound box wasn't a battle map. It wasn't a set of stolen radio codes or tactical intel. It contained something far more dangerous to a general who demanded cold, unfeeling efficiency from his war machine. It contained letters, dozens of them, unsent, unvetted, deeply personal letters written by men who knew they were going to die on these frozen hills. And at the very bottom of the box lay a single, tarnished pocket watch that didn't belong to Thomas. It belonged to Patton's own missing nephew, Lieutenant Arthur Patton, who had gone missing in action 3 days prior during the initial German surge through the forest. 7. Thomas looked Patton straight in the eye. He didn't see a god of war or a legendary commander. He saw a man burdened by the weight of thousands of lives, a man who built a wall of steel around his heart so he wouldn't break under the agony of sending boys to their graves. But Thomas also knew that if he handed the box over now, those letters would be confiscated, cataloged as potential security risks, and burned in the command post stove to protect operational security. The final words of 40 dying men would vanish into gray smoke. 6. I gave my word, General Thomas said, his voice steadier now, cutting through the wind. A promise to men who aren't here to speak for themselves anymore. 5. Patton's hand tightened on the grip of his weapon. He wasn't used to hesitation, let alone defiance. To Patton, discipline was the razor-thin margin between victory and annihilation. If one link broke, the entire chain shattered. Yet, as he looked down at the bleeding private, he saw no cowardice in the boy's eyes. He saw no rebellion born of fear. 4. The wind swept through the pine trees, sending a shower of dry snow over both of them. Captain Mercer stepped forward slightly, opening his mouth to speak, to yell at Thomas to surrender the satchel, but Patton raised his left hand, silencing the officer without looking back. 3. Thomas closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, preparing himself for whatever was to come. He thought of Arthur, the young lieutenant who had crawled into his foxhole as the German mortar fire flattened their position. Arthur had been bleeding from his gut, his life slipping away in the freezing mud. He had pressed the locked wooden box into Thomas's hands, whispering through cracked lips that his uncle must never get this box until the fight was over, because inside it was proof of a truth that would destroy the general's resolve before the battle was won. 2. Patton unsnapped the leather holster flap. The metallic click echoed through the quiet woods like a thunderclap. 1. Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't hand over the bag. He leaned his shoulder against the wooden crate, looked up into the hard, weathered face of the commander, and spoke 5 soft words that, "It belongs to Arthur, sir." The silence that followed was suffocating. Patton's hand remained motionless on his holster. The name seemed to strike him like a physical blow, though his rigid posture didn't give away an inch. His nephew, Arthur, was official listed as missing in action, presumed dead or captured after his platoon was cut off near the bridge at Longvalley. Patton had ordered 3 separate recon missions to find the boy, refusing to admit to his staff that his own blood was out there in the freezing dark. Every mission had returned empty-handed. "Where did you get that?" Patton demanded, his voice stripped of its performative rage, leaving behind a raw, gravelly edge. "He gave it to me, General," Thomas replied quietly, pulling the collar of his coat up against the wind. 3 nights ago, in the baseline woods outside Wiltz. He told me if I survived, I had to make sure these reached the families. He said you were a great general, but you were a terrible uncle because you never let yourself feel the weight of the boys you lost." Captain Mercer gasped, taking a step back, convinced that Thomas had just sealed his fate. Patton stood frozen, his eyes locked onto the locked satchel. The legendary commander, known for his relentless drive and unyielding iron will, looked at a ragged private bleeding through his uniform, carrying a dead man's secret through the snow. Patton slowly withdrew his hand from his revolver. He snapped the holster flap shut. The tension hanging over the camp shifted, but it did not dissipate. Instead, it transformed into a heavy, aching sorrow that seemed to weigh down every tree in the Ardennes. Patton took a step back, gesturing toward the command vehicle with a stiff flick of his wrist. "Get in the car, Private," Patton commanded flatly. Thomas didn't move right away. He looked at the command car, then at the frozen soldiers sitting in the trenches around him, watching the scene with wide, hollow eyes. "My squad is still out here," General Thomas said. Patton didn't turn around as he walked toward the vehicle. "They'll get their rations. Get in the car before I change my mind and have you shot for taking up my time." The drive back to the tactical headquarters in Bastogne was made in total silence. The command car bounced violently over the frozen ruts of the road, the tires throwing up snow against the undercarriage. Thomas sat in the leatherback seat, holding the wooden box in his lap, his frozen fingers finally starting to thaw, aching with a terrible, burning pain. Patton sat in the front passenger seat, staring straight ahead through the frosted windshield, his jaw set, his gloved hands resting on his knees. They arrived at an abandoned stone farmhouse that served as the temporary headquarters. Inside, radios crackled with frantic reports from the front lines. Maps pinned to the wooden walls were covered in red and blue grease pencil lines, showing the tightening German ring around the city. Officers rushed back and forth with papers, their voices tense and hushed. When Patton walked through the door, the room instantly came to attention, but the general ignored them all. He walked straight to a small side room, a former pantry converted into a private office, and motioned for Thomas to follow. Patton closed the heavy oak door behind them, shutting out the chaos of the war room. A single kerosene lamp burned on a rough wooden table, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. Patton pointed to a wooden chair across from him. "Sit," Patton said. Thomas sat down, placing the satchel on his lap. Patton stood over him, looking down at the young soldier. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small silver pocket knife, and tossed it onto the table in front of Thomas. "Open it," Patton ordered. Thomas looked at the knife, then up at the general. "Arthur gave me the key, sir, but he made me promise not to open it unless I was sure the letters would be sent. He knew what happened to mail during a siege. He knew officers censored everything that sounded like low morale. I'm the commander of this army," Patton said, his voice rising, a flash of his famed temper flaring up. "Nothing leaves this sector without my authority. You are sitting at command post while a division is being chewed to pieces 3 miles from here, holding a box of paper. Tell me why I shouldn't throw you in a stockade right now." "Because Arthur died holding this box, General," Thomas yelled back, standing up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. He forgot who he was talking to. He forgot the stars on Patton's collar. All he saw was the memory of a young lieutenant bleeding out in a frozen ditch, holding a wooden box as if it were the only thing that mattered in the universe. "He didn't die for a tactical map," Thomas continued, his voice shaking with anger and grief. "He died keeping a promise to 20 guys in his company who knew they weren't going home. He gathered their last words because he knew nobody else would. He didn't want them to be just numbers on your casualty reports, General. He wanted them to be human." Patton didn't strike him. He didn't shout. He stood entirely still, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the ghosts of thousands of young men scattered across. Slowly, Patton reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a small, brass key attached to a faded leather string. It was identical to the key Thomas held in his own pocket. Patton laid the key quietly on the wooden table next to the silver knife. "Arthur was my sister's only boy," Patton said, his voice unusually soft, almost lost beneath the quiet hum of the kerosene lamp. "Before he shipped out, I told him that in this uniform, he wasn't my nephew. He was an officer in the United States Army, and I expected him to act like one. I told him there was no room for sentimental nonsense in war, that feelings get men killed." Patton looked down at his own polished boots, the brilliant shine now streaked with gray mud from the camp. "He wrote to me 2 weeks ago," Patton continued. "He told me he was disobeying my advice. He said he was collecting letters from the men who were too wounded or too scared to write to their families. He called it his duty of memory. I sent him a reprimand. I told him to focus on his command and stop playing priest to dying men." Thomas looked at the key on the table. He picked it up, his hand trembling. He fitted the key into the small brass padlock on the satchel's inner wooden box. It turned with a soft, metallic click. Thomas lifted the lid. Inside lay dozens of folded pieces of paper, some stained with dirt, others spotted with dried blood. On top of the stack sat a silver pocket watch, its glass crystal cracked in a starburst pattern. Patton's eyes fixed on the watch. He reached out with a hand that had commanded armies, a hand that had never trembled in the face of artillery or political ruin, and gently picked up the watch. He turned it over. Engraved on the back were the words, "To Arthur, from Uncle George. Stand firm." He died 3 nights ago? Patton asked, his eyes never leaving the cracked face of the watch. Yes, sir, Thomas said softly. We were pinned down near the road to Wilt's. A mortar hit the edge of our foxhole. Arthur took the worst of it. He knew he didn't have much time. He gave me the box and his watch. He told me to tell you that he stood firm, but that standing firm doesn't mean forgetting who you're standing for. Patton stood motionless for a long time. The kerosene lamp flickered as a draft swept under the door, casting deep shadows across the general's harsh features. A single tear escaped his eye, tracking down the deep lines carved into his cheek, before he quickly wiped it away with the back of his leather glove. He cleared his throat, a sharp, ragged sound, and picked up the top letter from a stack. It was written on the back of a ration wrapper, scribbled in faint pencil. Patton read the name on the envelope aloud. Private First Class James Miller. No relation to Thomas. A boy from Ohio. What does it say? Patton asked softly, looking at Thomas. Thomas remembered sitting in the dark, listening to James whisper the words while the artillery shook the ground beneath them. He says goodbye to his mother, General. He tells her not to hate the war, because he went willingly so his younger brother wouldn't have to. And he asked her to make sure his dog was taken care of. Patton unfolded the paper. He read the shaky handwriting silently. Then he picked up another letter. And another. He read about a farm in Iowa, a newborn baby in Georgia that a 20-year-old sergeant would never see, and a young man asking his father to forgive him for dropping out of college before he enlisted. For 2 hours, while the war raged outside and his staff officers waited for orders to shift artillery batteries and supply lines, General George S. Patton sat in a dim pantry in Bastogne, reading the last words of the men he had commanded into the jaws of death. He didn't look at maps. He didn't ask for casualty numbers. He listened as Thomas told him about each man, how they had lived, how they had laughed, and how they had died holding on to the hope that someone, somewhere, would remember them. Around midnight, a knock came at the door. Captain Mercer stepped in, looking nervous. General, the German counterattack at the southern perimeter is pushing hard, Mercer said. General McAuliffe is asking for armored support from the 4th Armored Division. We need your operational order to move the tanks. Patton slowly folded the letter he was holding and placed it carefully back into the wooden box. He stood up, straight and rigid once more, but the cold, distant look in his eyes had changed. It was replaced by a dangerous, terrifying resolve that was no longer built on cold tactical arithmetic, but on a fierce, personal fury. Tell the 4th Armored to advance immediately, Patton said, his voice ringing through the small room like iron striking an anvil. Drive them hard. I want every German unit in that sector crushed before dawn. Yes, General, Mercer said, turning to leave. Mercer, Patton called out. The captain paused. Yes, sir. Get Private Miller a fresh uniform, a warm meal, and put him on the first transport back to the rear medical station. His war is over. Thomas stood up. General, no. I promised Arthur I would make sure these letters get posted myself. Patton walked over to Thomas. He placed a heavy, gloved hand on the young soldier's uninjured shoulder. He looked down into Thomas's eyes, no longer as a commander scolding an inferior, but as a man acknowledging a brother in arms. You fulfilled your promise, son, Patton said gently. You carried the dead when nobody else could. Now let me do my job so you can go home and deliver them. Patton picked up the wooden box, closed the lid, and turned the key in the lock. He handed the box back to Thomas, but then pulled a small, official army seal from his desk drawer. He stamped the heavy leather satchel with his personal commander's seal, a red wax crest that gave the satchel absolute priority clearance across the entire European theater of operations. No military police officer, no censor, and no bureaucrat will touch this bag now, Patton said. It will travel with you on the plane to London and directly to the Postal Command in Washington. You will deliver every single one of those letters yourself, private. That is an order. Thank you, General, Thomas whispered. Patton walked to the door, opened it, and looked back at Thomas one last time. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the cracked silver pocket watch that had belonged to his nephew, and held it out toward Thomas. Take it, Patton said. I can't take that, sir, Thomas replied. That was Arthur's. It belongs to your family. Patton shook his head slowly. Arthur gave it to you because you were there with him when the world was ending. Keep it to remind yourself that even in the middle of hell, you chose to be human. Patton turned and walked out into the main command room. His voice boomed across the headquarters, sharp, clear, and relentless, ordering movements, coordinating artillery, and driving his army forward into the frozen darkness to break the siege of Bastogne. 2 weeks later, Thomas sat in a warm, quiet room at a military hospital in southern England. His shoulder was healing, though the scar would remain for the rest of his life. Resting on the bedside table next to him was the leather satchel, stamped with Patton's crimson seal, alongside the cracked silver pocket watch. A nurse entered, carrying a small stack of official travel papers. "Private Miller, your transport to the States leaves tomorrow morning," she said with a warm smile. "You're going home." Thomas looked at the leather bag. Inside were 39 letters that were about to find their way to quiet living rooms, farmhouses, and city apartments across America. 39 families who would receive a piece of their sons back, saved from the ice and oblivion by a brave young lieutenant who refused to let his men be forgotten, and a private who refused to yield, even when facing the fiercest commander in the army. Months later, long after the war in Europe had finally ground to its tragic, victorious end, Thomas walked up the gravel pathway of a small wooden house in Ohio. He carried a single, worn envelope in his hand. He knocked on the door. When a tired, gray-haired woman opened it, looking at his uniform with a mixture of hope and fear, Thomas didn't offer a dry, cold telegram from the War Department. He took off his cap, smiled softly, and handed her the letter written on a grease-stained ration wrapper. "Your son wanted you to know that he wasn't afraid," Thomas said gently, "and he wanted to make sure you took care of his dog." The woman collapsed into tears, holding the paper to her heart, pressing the faded pencil marks against her face as if she could still feel the warmth of her boy's hand. In war, victory is measured in miles captured, cities liberated, and flags raised over fallen strongholds. History books remember the generals who drew the lines on the maps and drove the armies through the snow. But the true heart of history lives in the quiet promises kept between ordinary men when everything else is stripped away. Power can command an army to march into the fire, but only love can carry their names back out of the dark.